Summer, 1943. Camp Crossville, Tennessee. A German soldier sat at a wooden table, staring at the bottle in his hands. Brown liquid fizzed inside, bubbles racing to the surface before popping with a gentle hiss. He had never seen anything like it. 2 years earlier, in North Africa, he had marched through dust storms and heat, surviving on hard biscuits and ersatz coffee, a bitter imitation made from roasted barley. And now, in this strange new world, he was holding something almost magical. A sweet, carbonated drink called Coca-Cola. It had cost him 5 cents from the camp canteen. The guards told him that American children paid the exact same price with their allowances. For the soldier, this was unthinkable. In Germany, even children grew up in scarcity. Yet here, even prisoners of war could casually buy a cold soft drink. That summer, 371,000 German prisoners across America confronted a reality that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had drilled into them. They discovered a nation where ice cream was not a luxury, but an everyday dessert. Where chocolate bars were sold casually, like bread rolls at home. The Reich had promised them glory through sacrifice. But what these men found in America was the mathematics of abundance. The Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. Around 250,000 German and Italian soldiers fell into Allied hands. They expected cruelty. Propaganda warned them of starvation, beatings, perhaps even death. Instead, within hours of capture, they were eating pancakes with syrup. Military records show U.S. Army rations included eggs, milk, crackers, cheese, candy, and cigarettes. For American soldiers, ordinary. For German prisoners, feasts. One officer later testified, "We expected to be starved. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army. That was the beginning of our education. Education, through food." And the most shocking lesson was still to come, the taste of ice cream, in the middle of the Atlantic. When the ships docked in Norfolk, Newport News, and New York, the prisoners saw what propaganda denied. Ports moving more cargo daily than German ports did in weeks. Shops stacked high with candy and Coca-Cola bottles, 5 cents each, everywhere. On the trains inland, they expected cattle cars. Instead, passenger coaches with dining cars serving fried chicken, vegetables, pie, and coffee. By the time they reached permanent camps, Crossville, Herne, Aliceville, the shock deepened. Heated barracks. Electric lights. Flush toilets. And at the PX store, prisoners could spend their wages on candy, Coke, even ice cream. In Germany, luxuries vanished. In America, even prisoners lived surrounded by them. Coca-Cola. The symbol of America's industrial democracy. In 1943 alone, 5 billion bottles were made. Standardized taste from Maine to Texas, astounding German engineers. At Camp Herne, Texas, POWs drank 7,000 bottles in one summer week. Then came the ice cream. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, butter pecan, flavors Germans had never seen. Camps ordered 50 to 100 gallons weekly. On July 4, 1943, POWs watched Americans churn it by hand. And sugar, rationed to scraps in Germany, sat casually on American mess tables. Guards even threw hardened sugar away. To Germans, this was sacrilege. They began to realize. Germany had lied. By 1945, the transformation was complete. They had entered believing in German superiority. They left believing in American abundance. Newsreels showed GIs handing chocolate to starving German children. The Reich promised strength through sacrifice. America showed strength through generosity. Some prisoners gained weight in captivity while their families starved. They sent parcels of food home, coffee, chocolate, canned meat. For many Germans, their first taste of recovery came from defeated soldiers returning with American goods. For months, the barbed wire fences of American prison camps had seemed like the edge of the world. Inside, the food was better than German soldiers had ever known: meat, milk, candy bars, even ice cream. But nothing prepared them for the moment the gates opened, and they were sent to work beyond the fence. By 1944, America faced a labor shortage. Farms, factories, and even small-town diners needed hands. So truckloads of German prisoners were escorted into the heart of American life. What they discovered outside was more shocking than anything inside. The first surprise came on the farms. Trucks bounced down country roads past endless cornfields, orchards heavy with fruit, and pastures crowded with cattle. To men raised on rationing and hunger, the sheer scale of American agriculture was overwhelming. In Germany, food had become a matter of survival. Here, it was abundance without end. At harvest time, prisoners picked baskets of tomatoes, beans, and peaches. But what stunned them was the waste. Perfectly edible fruit was tossed aside for being slightly bruised or too small. In Germany, such food would have been a treasure. Here, it was fed to animals or left to rot. The message was unmistakable: America had so much, it could afford to be careless. Factories revealed a different kind of shock. Inside canneries and packing plants, assembly lines moved with dizzying speed. Machines sealed thousands of cans an hour, while quality inspectors rejected food that would have fed entire families back in Europe. The efficiency, the standardization, and the casual abundance demonstrated an industrial capacity the Germans had never imagined. But nothing compared to the experience of working near America's diners. Guards would post up by the door while prisoners mopped floors or washed dishes, giving them a front-row seat to the rhythm of everyday life. There, German ideology unraveled in silence. Because in these diners, class lines dissolved. A factory worker in dusty overalls sat at the same counter as a banker in a crisp suit. Both ordered hamburgers and Coca-Cola. Both laughed with the same waitress. There was no privilege, no separation of rank, no officer's table. Food was democratic, available to anyone with a few coins in their pocket. The sight that struck deepest was children with nickels in their hands. Schoolboys and girls climbed onto stools, ordering Coca-Cola or towering ice cream sundaes. For men who had left behind starving families, the contrast was unbearable. American children ate luxuries German officers hadn't seen in years. What kind of society was this, where desserts were so common that even kids treated them as routine? Beyond the fence, the psychological demolition of Nazi propaganda accelerated. These were not isolated luxuries staged for show. They were everyday realities: farms overflowing with food, factories rejecting abundance as waste, diners where anyone could sit side by side and order a slice of pie. Inside the camp, ice cream and Coca-Cola had felt miraculous. Outside, they understood the full scale of the miracle. America had built a system so productive, so democratic, that it extended even to the smallest towns, even to children, even to prisoners of war. The guards eventually loaded them back into the trucks and returned them to their camps. The barbed wire closed again behind them. But what they had seen could not be forgotten. For many, the realization cut deeper than defeat on the battlefield. Nazi propaganda had painted America as weak, decadent, incapable of lasting strength. Yet beyond the fence, the truth was undeniable: this abundance was not weakness. It was power. And that power, sweeter and more devastating than any weapon, was about to break the foundations of everything they believed. Back inside the camps, the days followed a rhythm: work, meals, roll call. But the real war was no longer on the battlefield. It was unfolding quietly, in the minds of prisoners, through the paper thinness of letters. Every few weeks, mail arrived from Germany. Censors inspected each envelope, blacking out sensitive details, but enough words slipped through to reveal the truth. Families wrote of hunger, of bread lines stretching for blocks, of children whose cheeks had hollowed with malnutrition. Mothers described splitting one potato among 4 mouths, boiling weeds for soup, saving scraps of coal for heat. The contrast was unbearable. In the camps, sugar bowls sat openly on tables, waiting for anyone to scoop as much as they liked. In Germany, sugar was rationed to a handful of grams per month. Here, milk was served daily in tall glasses. In Germany, milk had become a memory. Here, prisoners bought candy bars at the PX for 5 cents. In Germany, their families hadn't seen chocolate in years. It was not just the abundance, it was the casualness of it. In America, luxuries were treated as routine, available to anyone, even to enemies. Back home, survival itself had become a daily struggle. Some prisoners tried to explain away the difference. Surely, they argued, this was all propaganda. Perhaps America was only showing its best face to break them. But doubt crept in when they realized their families' letters confirmed exactly what they saw with their own eyes. No staged theater could fake the scale of overflowing farms, or the children casually tossing nickels onto diner counters. The letters became daggers in the heart of Nazi ideology. The Reich had promised that sacrifice at home was noble, that starvation was temporary, that Germany was building a future of strength. But prisoners saw the truth in ink and paper. Their families were starving, not for victory, but for nothing. Meanwhile, they, the defeated, were gaining weight in captivity. One report recorded the transformation with cold precision. The average German prisoner in America consumed 3,300 to 3,600 calories a day. In Germany, civilians survived on 1,200 to 1,500. The numbers told a story no propaganda could undo. Prisoners ate better in defeat than their families did in supposed freedom. The psychological effect was devastating. Conversations around barracks tables turned bitter. Men who once shouted slogans in North Africa now whispered doubts in the Tennessee night. If America could feed its enemies like this, what chance had Germany ever really had? Then came the packages. With the money they earned from camp labor, prisoners were allowed to purchase goods and send them home through the International Red Cross. Canned meat, chocolate, coffee, treasures that traveled across the ocean to hungry families. The irony cut deep. German soldiers, once loyal to the Reich, were now feeding their wives and children with American abundance. What did that say about the state they had fought for? What did that say about the weak democracy they had been taught to despise? Prisoners began to speak openly of betrayal, not by America, but by their own leaders. The Reich had promised victory through discipline, sacrifice, and conquest. But America showed another model: prosperity through production, strength through abundance, democracy sustained not by fear but by plenty. The collapse of ideology was not sudden. It was slow, like the crumbling of a wall struck by waves again and again. Each letter, each package, each sight of American waste and generosity eroded the foundation of belief. Until one day, the wall fell completely. By late 1944, the transformation was visible. Men who once swore by Hitler now clipped newspaper articles about American industry, tracing numbers with their fingers in disbelief. Men who once sneered at decadent Coca-Cola now dreamed of opening cafes, bakeries, and shops back home. The transformation began slowly. Small black markets gave way to organized barter. Former prisoners brought back skills from American farms and factories, new methods of planting, ideas about mechanization, even recipes from diners and PX stores. In ruined neighborhoods, tiny businesses emerged: coffee stands, shoe repair stalls, makeshift bakeries. But the real turning point came in 1948, when the United States launched the Marshall Plan. Billions of dollars in aid poured into Europe, and Germany, though defeated, became one of its largest beneficiaries. Food shipments arrived by the ton: wheat, milk powder, sugar. Machinery followed: tractors, presses, lathes. Soon, new factories were rising from the rubble, fueled not by war production but by consumer demand. For ordinary Germans, it felt like watching spring emerge after a brutal winter. Shelves that had been bare began to fill again. Bread came without ration cards. Markets offered butter, meat, and even fruit. Families who had lived in ruins now saw reconstruction projects rebuilding homes, roads, and railways. And in this rebirth, the influence of America's abundance was unmistakable. Many who had once been prisoners became advocates of modernization. They told stories of diners where workers and bankers sat together, of farms where waste was unthinkable because productivity was endless, of factories where efficiency was measured not in slogans but in output. This mindset fueled the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. By the early 1950s, West Germany was no longer a land of rubble and rationing. It was a land of opportunity, growth, and optimism. German industry surged, exports climbed, and prosperity returned faster than anyone had believed possible. Of course, not everyone welcomed the transformation. Some still clung to the past, bitter about defeat, suspicious of American influence. But for the majority, the memory of hunger was too fresh, the taste of abundance too unforgettable. Ideology could be debated. Stomachs could not. The true revolution was not just in economics, but in mentality. A generation that had once believed strength came from discipline and conquest now understood that strength could come from prosperity, stability, and production. They had seen that democracy was not weakness, but resilience, the ability to feed its people, rebuild its cities, and share its wealth. The barbed wire was long gone. But the lessons learned behind it now shaped the foundation of a new Germany. And yet, the story was not over. For what began with ice cream, Coca-Cola, and diners in wartime America would soon return across the Atlantic, this time not as memory, but as reality. Because the next chapter would not be about survival, or even recovery. It would be about cultural transformation. Ideology could be debated. Stomachs could not. The true revolution was not just in economics, but in mentality. A generation that had once believed strength came from discipline and conquest now understood that strength could come from prosperity, stability, and production. They had seen that democracy was not weakness, but resilience, the ability to feed its people, rebuild its cities, and share its wealth. The barbed wire was long gone. But the lessons learned behind it now shaped the foundation of a new Germany. And yet, the story was not over. For what began with ice cream, Coca-Cola, and diners in wartime America would soon return across the Atlantic, this time not as memory, but as reality, because the next chapter would not be about survival, or even recovery. It would be about cultural transformation. By the 1950s, Germany was no longer a land of ruins. The rubble had been cleared, factories roared to life, and a new economy surged forward. But what came next was even more profound. It was not just about rebuilding buildings or restoring industries. It was about reshaping daily life itself, how people ate, drank, shopped, and even imagined their future. And at the center of this transformation stood a handful of symbols. They were not tanks, not planes, not flags. They were bottles, burgers, and neon signs. Coca-Cola had already been whispered about in prisoner camps as a liquid symbol of American plenty. Now, for the first time, it flowed freely in German streets. Bright red trucks delivered glass bottles clinking with fizz. Shops stacked them in pyramids at the front of their windows. For a generation raised on bitter chicory coffee and thin barley tea, the explosion of sweetness was unforgettable. To drink Coca-Cola was not just to quench thirst. It was to sip modernity, to taste the promise that tomorrow would be better than yesterday. Soon after came McDonald's, arriving with its golden arches and astonishing speed. For Germans used to long waits at ration counters, the idea of ordering food and receiving it within minutes felt like science fiction. Burgers, fries, and shakes were not simply meals. They were proof that efficiency, abundance, and friendliness could exist together. Families brought their children to eat under the arches not just for food, but for an experience that whispered, "This is the future." And then came supermarkets. Vast aisles lined with goods, shelves stacked higher than a person could reach, and choices beyond comprehension. For years, Germans had measured food by scarcity: how many grams of butter, how many slices of bread, how many potatoes per week. now, they stood before overflowing displays of fruit, tins, meat, and sweets, able to choose freely. The act of shopping itself became an expression of freedom. This transformation was so deep that sociologists began calling it the je suis theory. The idea was simple: true power was not only in armies or factories. It was in shaping everyday desires, in filling stomachs and living rooms, in giving ordinary people small joys that would quietly redefine what they believed was possible. The Cold War made the contrast even sharper. In East Germany, scarcity lingered, queues for butter, long waits for meat, a grey monotony in daily life. In West Germany, Coca-Cola fizzed, McDonald's sizzled, supermarkets dazzled. It was not just politics that drew the line. It was the taste of sugar versus the taste of shortages, the smell of fresh burgers versus the smell of empty bread lines. For millions, the choice became obvious. They no longer dreamed of power through conquest. They dreamed of family cars, Sunday meals, shiny kitchens, and children who would never know hunger. And in that dream, American abundance had permanently altered the German imagination. This was the final victory, not won on the battlefield, but in the marketplace. The culture of plenty seeped into language, habits, and identity. A bottle of Coca-Cola on a dinner table was no longer foreign, it was normal. A trip to the supermarket was no longer exotic, it was routine. The Golden Arches became not just a place to eat, but a meeting point, a ritual, a marker of belonging to a new world. And yet, if you looked closer, you could still see the shadows of the past. Behind every sip of cola was the memory of bitter coffee substitute. Behind every fast food meal was the echo of wartime soup kitchens. Behind every supermarket display was the haunting image of ration cards. That memory gave the new abundance its sharpest edge. Because the Germans who embraced it were not naive. They remembered what it meant to go without. They remembered what it meant to see children hungry. And so they clung to the new life with both hands, determined never to let it slip away again. By the 1960s, West Germany had become one of the most prosperous nations in the world. Its people, once prisoners, once survivors, were now consumers, travelers, builders of a modern society. They had not only rebuilt their country, they had remade their culture. And it all began with the simplest of things: a bottle of Coca-Cola behind a fence, a bar of chocolate in a ration pack, a memory of what abundance could feel like. The war had ended in fire and rubble. But the peace was built on sweetness, speed, and choice. And that is the untold story of how victory was not only won with armies, but with ideas, desires, and everyday life itself. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a tank. It's the promise of a better tomorrow, wrapped in a bottle, a burger, and a brightly lit aisle.